Hello everyone, it's Parisha from the Artistic Scroll, and in today's tutorial we're going to learn how to draw this magical crystal ball in Procreate. So before we get started, here's what you'll need: your iPad and pencil, the Procreate app, and the sketch file and color palette for the tutorial, which you can download for free from the Artistic Archive, which is my special vault of free resources that I've created just for you. So go ahead and download them now, and let's dive into the tutorial. So this is what your canvas will look like when you go ahead and open it in Procreate. As you can see, the sketch is already there on layer 1, and we just need to fill in the color for the background to be able to see the sketch a bit better. So let's go ahead and set the crystal ball color palette as default and move the menu to the left, and then tap on the background color menu and then select this really dark teal color, and you can finally see your sketch. Okay, so now we're just going to rename our sketch layer as sketch so that it's easily identifiable later on. And then let's go ahead and create a new layer and move it under the sketch layer. And then reduce the sketch layer's opacity to somewhere around 20%. Just enough so that you can see what you're doing. Okay, so on our new layer now, we're going to select this first light green color. And then with the technical pen brush, we're going to go ahead and create the crystal ball itself. So let's go ahead and create an outline. So this can be like a rough circle shape, but as soon as you tap on the screen and then let go of your pencil, you'll see that it forms a perfect circle. That's a quick shape function of Procreate. Really nice one. So then go ahead and fill it in. And there you go, you've just created your crystal ball shape. Great, so next we're going to be working on our brass stand itself. So create a new layer and move it under the green ball layer. And then with this dark gold color, we're going to create the stand in different steps. So this will be the first brass stand step, because it'll just be easier for us to manage all our highlights and shadows later on. So we're creating all of this in different steps itself, in different layers. So next, create a new layer and move it under that. This will be our second brass step. So we can always say like, the first one will be brass layer 1, this will be brass layer 2. So in total, there will be 5 brass layers, which is just a way of simplifying things for us later on. So go ahead and complete the shape and then fill it in. All right. So next, create a new layer and move it under brass layer 2. We're now creating brass layer 3. And then fill it in. Okay, so now create a new layer and move it under brass layer 3. It's time to create brass layer 4. So as you can see, brass layer 4 has these teardrop patterns that we'll be working on a bit later. And as for the rest of the brass layers, we'll be working on all of them together because they've got similar sort of patterns in a way. So complete the shape and then fill it in. And once you're happy, create a new layer under brass layer 4 and then draw and fill in brass layer 5. Okay, so that looks great. Next we're going to be creating a new layer right on top of the ball, and this will be our vertical brass stand area that you can see. So I just want to be able to see the ends of our vertical brass layer a bit better, so I've reduced the opacity of layers 1 and 2, and we're just going to create the outlines for these. And then fill them in. And then when you're happy with that, go ahead and bring the opacities of both layers 1 and 2 back to normal. Next we'll be working on these drops and the stars. So for the drops layer, create a new layer above the ball layer, and then paint in these lines that are almost like the chains for the stars. Then create a new layer again above the ball, and then with this pale yellow color, which is right at the end of the first row of colors, go ahead and paint in the stars and fill those in. And then just move this stars layer above the drops layer. Alright, so that looks great. Next we'll be working on the gems and the inlays. So to be able to see them a bit better, let's go ahead and reduce the opacities of brass layers 2 and 5 a bit more. And then we'll be creating a new layer above brass layer 2. So that's where our gems and the inlays will be. And for the gems, we'll start off with this darker green color, which is next to the crystal ball green, and then paint in the gems. All the gems will be on one layer, and then we'll be creating these gold inlays, actually not gold, brass inlays below this gems layer. So let's go ahead and outline all of these gems first, and then we'll fill them in. So we've got the round gems up on top, and then we've got these diamonds at the bottom. And then fill them all in. Okay, so create a new layer below the gems layer now. And with the same dark brass color, we'll be painting in these inlays. We'll start off with just these brass inlays around the gems first. And then we'll work on the swirling inlays a little later with a different brush. Mainly because the technical pen brush isn't one that has a constant thickness throughout, because it's a pressure sensitive brush. So we'll be working on the other swirls with a different brush, namely the monoline brush in calligraphy, as you'll see in a minute. So we're just outlining these inlays and then filling them in. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Now for the rest of the inlays, like I mentioned, we'll be going to calligraphy in the brush library and then duplicating the monoline brush. Now tap on the duplicated brush and tap on stabilization. Increase the amount of streamline to maximum. This will help you to form really nice lines without any, any waviness or difficulty in the streamline of it. So reduce the size of the brush to minimum and then paint in these swirls. Streamline really helps you get very nice flowing lines rather than ones that are quite ragged. So it's a good way to tweak up your brushes. Alright, so that looks great. Now we can return to our technical pen brush and bring back the opacities of both layers 2 and 5 to max. Let's work on our crystal ball now. So go ahead and create a new clipping mask to the ball layer. And then in airbrushing, let's go ahead and select the soft airbrush. And with this darker green color, which was the same color as the gems, go ahead and paint in a darker gradient in the ball itself, leaving a bit of a rim peripherally so that it's lighter at the edge. And then we're going to create another clipping mask and then change the blend mode of this layer to multiply. And then select the background dark teal color. And then with that color, go ahead and paint in another kind of dark gradient. It kind of needs to give a depth to the ball itself. So we're trying to leave a central area a bit more paler in the way. And then reduce the opacity of this layer to around 40%. And then you can even try and blend it in with the soft airbrush or the soft brush, just so that it kind of melds in with the rest of the ball and isn't very stark. So that looks kind of nice. Yeah. We're going to create another clipping mask now and change the blend mode of this one to multiply again, and then increase the depth. in some of the areas with the same color, and then blend all of that into. So this is a nice way to be able to draw some glass texture too, especially in balls like crystal balls or marbles or round gems. This is a nice technique that you can use for that. Okay, so once you're happy with that, we'll go ahead and create another clipping mask on top. And then change the blend mode of this layer to add this time. We're going to be creating in these highlights. So with the technical pen brush and inking and the white color in your color palette, let's go ahead and paint in these outlines for the highlights of this bowl. So we'll just be creating in these ellipses first. Not very happy with this one, so I'm going to undo that and create a new one. So again, this is just another technique of adding in highlights. I've just created different shapes on the ball, you might say, which will kind of delineate areas of highlights and areas of shadows on the bowl. So these are the areas where we do not want our highlights to be. So we're going to fill in the rest of it, as you can see. And then reduce the opacity of this layer to just about 4%. We don't need a lot of it to be shining out right now. We'll be blurring all of these later, but let's just go ahead and create another clipping mask and change the blend mode to add again. We're adding another layer of highlights, and this time these will be more peripherally around the bowl itself. So draw around this ellipse, which is more peripheral in the sketch. And then fill it in. Then reduce the opacity of this layer to just about 10%. Okay, now we're going to create another clipping mask on top, and this time that will be for the spot highlight. So change the blend mode of this layer to add. And then as you can see, this little ellipse that we've got here, we're going to paint that in. Okay, so next we're going to be blurring out all of these highlights. So let's go back to the first highlight layer, and then in the adjustments panel, go to Gaussian blur, and then apply a blur of around 5%. Then move on to the second highlights layer, and then apply a blur of about 7% to this one. And then for our spot highlight layer, we'll apply a blur of around 9%. Okay, so those are looking good. Let's create a new clipping mask on top of this and keep the blend mode as normal this time. And with the soft airbrush, paint in this really peripheral edge of a highlight, and then just a little spot on the spot highlight too. Then apply a Gaussian blur of around 9% to this one too. Then go ahead and duplicate this layer and change the blend mode of the top duplicated layer to add, and then reduce the opacity of this layer to 15%. You can even reduce the opacity of the normal layer to around 80%. It's looking a nice, shiny, glowy crystal ball. Now we need to add in a little bit of the gold or brassy reflection on the ball itself. So let's create a new layer, a new clipping mask, just below the dark teal layers. And then with the pale yellow color and the soft airbrush, the soft brush actually, it'll give you a nice coverage. Reduce the size a bit to around 3 to 5%, actually 7% would be great. And just around the lower edge of the ball, paint in this pale yellow reflection of the brass stand. And then you can blend this out as well. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, so for our next step, we're going to be going ahead and duplicating our main crystal ball layer and then changing the blend mode of the lower duplicated layer to add and applying a Gaussian blur to this layer of about 8%. As you can see, our ball is now glowing. So we're done with the crystal ball itself. Let's go ahead and group all of these layers and rename this group as ball. Alright, so our next step would be to start working on the stands themselves. So we're going to move this vertical layer just below the stars and then change the blend mode of a clipping mask, add it to that to multiply. And then with the bronze color, I keep saying bronze, brass and gold, sorry, it is brass. With this dark bronze color, we're going to be painting in the shadows with the soft airbrush. Let's paint in these shadows wherever we're thinking will be opposite the highlights layer. We'll be adding the highlights in the next step later on. But our main aim for adding in all of these shadows and highlights is there will be 2 layers for the shadows and 2 layers for the highlights. So blur this first layer to around 3% and then create a new clipping mask. Change the blend mode to multiply again. And with the same brass color, we're painting in some more shadows just around the curves. And then apply a Gaussian blur of 3% to this as well. Next, we're going to be painting in the highlights. So create a new clipping mask, change the blend mode to add, and with the same brass color, opposite to our shadows, we're painting in the highlights. And then apply a Gaussian blur, again of 3%. And one more layer of highlights, so create a new clipping mask, change the blend mode to add, and this time with this pale yellow color next to the brass color, we're painting in the highlights just in some areas of the stand itself, the vertical stand. And then apply a blur again of around 3%. Okay, so that's looking pretty nice. We'll be following the same kind of steps on the rest of the stand itself. So let's go ahead and group all of these layers together and then rename this group as vertical brass. Okay, so let's start with the first layer. We're going to be working on each of these layers. So with the first brass layer, create a new clipping mask and change the blend mode of that to multiply. We're adding in the shadows first. So I'm just preparing all of these clipping masks for the layers together because it will be working on all the shadows in one layer first, as in one synchronous group. So create clipping masks to all of these layers, all the brass layers, and then change the blend modes to multiply. It's just easier if we work through all of them as a group. So going back to the first clipping mask on brass layer 1 with the brass color itself and the soft airbrush, the size is about 10%. Paint in these areas of, well, we won't call them shadows exactly, they're more like the chrome effect that we're trying to achieve here. So paint in these areas of darker chrome effect. And then apply a Gaussian blur of about 3% to this layer. Next we move on to the clipping mask for the layer 2. And as you can see, just around the areas where we painted in the chrome effect, the darker chrome effect for layer 1, we're continuing that effect for layer 2. This is why it's better to work continuously, like as a group, through all the layers so that we don't miss out on any borders and consistencies. So moving on to the not the shadow layer, the darker chrome effect layer for layer 3. We're painting in these darker gradients there on the new clipping mask there. And you can see it's forming a nice curved sort of an effect. Okay, so layer 4's time. Layer 4 is quite different from the rest of them, so we're just working on one shadow layer here right now, as you can see, and then blur it up as well. This one will be blurred a bit more, about 6%. All the others are blurred just about 3%. And then to the clipping mask on layer 5, we're adding in some more areas of darker chrome effect here. And then apply a Gaussian blur of 3%. Okay, so that looks good. Now we're going to be adding another layer of shadows or darker gradient to this. So create a new clipping mask, change the blend mode to multiply. With the same brass color, just some areas we're adding in some darker chrome effect swashes. So repeat this step for layer 2 as well. Create a new clipping mask, change the blend mode to multiply, and then continue that line downwards from layer 1 onto layer 2's clipping mask. As you can see, we're following the same thing that we did for the vertical stand. 2 layers of darker gradients or shadows and 2 layers of highlights. Now repeat this step for layer 3's clipping mask as well. We've created a new clipping mask and changed the blend mode to multiply and continued the line downwards. And once you're satisfied with that, we've applied a blur of 3%. Next, we're going to move on to layer 5, create a new clipping mask there, and then change the blend mode to multiply, and we're adding in some more darker chrome effect areas there. It's looking a bit odd right now, but once we add in the highlights, you'll understand what I mean. And we've applied a blur again of about 3%. Now it's time to go ahead and add in the highlights. So starting off with layer 1, create a new clipping mask and change the blend mode to add. And with the same brass color, we're adding in the highlights, or the lighter chrome effect areas. Now take a look as to exactly where I'm placing in these effects. We want to make sure that we have all sort of alternating light and dark areas. Now use the stucco brush in painting as your smudge tool to get a weathered kind of effect for your brass texture. We're using the brush size of about 6% and with an opacity of 70%. Now just lightly drag in the highlight color. As you can see, it gives a nice kind of weathered texture to it. So we're going to repeat this step with our layer 2 as well. Create a new clipping mask there, change the blend mode to add, and with the same brass color, we're painting in and continuing the highlights from layer 1 onto this layer as well. And just around the edges as well here, it gives off a nice effect. Then apply a blur of around 3%. And then with the stucco brush as your smudge tool, very lightly smudge the highlights to get this weathered, grainy kind of texture that we see so often in our brass instruments. Now create a new clipping mask and change the blend mode to add for layer 3 as well, and we're continuing our first layer of highlights onto this layer 2. Apply a Gaussian blur again, 3%, and then smudge it out with the stucco brush. You have to be very light with this brush. It's better to build up your smudging than smudging it all in one go. And if you feel like there are some areas which are incongruent with each other, just go to the softer airbrush and smudge it into place. As you can see here, I'm trying to align these two together. And just very lightly bring in that weathered texture a bit. We're going to repeat this step for layer 5 as well. So create a new clipping mask there and change the blend mode to add again. And with the soft airbrush, paint in the highlights. I hope it's making a bit more sense now. We're trying to get these highlights in and there's a chrome effect that we're trying to achieve. Alright, so blur it up to 3% and then you know the drill, we're going to blur it out with the stucco brush. Not blur, blend. Blend it out with the stucco brush. Okay, so that looks beautiful. We're going to add one more layer of highlights now, just as we did for our vertical brass. So create a new clipping mask there, to layer 1, change the blend mode to add again, and this time we're using our pale yellow color for just slight areas of highlights. We're not going overboard with this one. And then blur it up again to 3% and then use the stucco brush to get your weathery texture. Okay. Let's just group all of these first together because it's getting a bit difficult to locate them. We're naming the layer 1 as brass 1. And then create a new clipping mask to layer 2. And with the same pale yellow color and continuing our highlights down onto layer 2 from layer 1. I'm going to be painting in the second layer of highlights. Then blur it up 3% again. And then with the stucco brush, blend it out to get that weathery, grainy effect. Now group all of these layers together and then rename this group as brass 2. Alright, so we're going to brass 3 now. So let's create a new clipping mask there, change the blend mode to add, And then with the soft airbrush and the pale yellow color, continue your highlights down to this layer as well. Blur it up 3%, and then apply that grainy effect with the stucco brush blending tool. And then we group all of these layers together as well and rename the group as Brass 3. Now create a new clipping mask to layer 5 and change the blend mode to add. And then continue your highlights again. If it's going a bit too fast for you, don't worry, it's the video slightly sped up just because it's a bit dull to be going at normal pace with this, so feel free to pause it and continue at your own pace. So blur it up again 3%, and then go ahead and apply that grainy texture with the stucco brush. That looks great. Let's group all of these layers together now and then rename this group as Brass 5. So next we're going to be creating a new clipping mask to layer 4 and changing the blend mode to multiply. Actually, let's go ahead and change it to add. We need to add a layer of highlight first. So we're going to select the same brass color and then with the soft airbrush, just paint in a single curved line of highlights there and apply a Gaussian blur of about 6% to it. Now we're seeing that we just need to kind of reduce the opacity of some of these highlight layers a bit because it's a bit too shiny. So we're going back to Brass Group 1 and then reducing the opacity of both of these highlight layers to about 45%. And then we're going to go to Brass Group 2 and then reducing the opacity of these layers of the highlights layers to about 65%. And then in Brass Group 3, we're reducing the opacities again to around, let's say, 55% for both of the highlight layers. Okay, so that's looking a bit better. And then for Brass Group 5, we're reducing the opacity of the highlights layers just slightly to about 80% for both of them. Actually, yeah, I think we can just do with the top highlight layer. Now returning to our brass layer 5, we've created a new clipping mask and changed the blend mode of that to multiply. And then with the technical pen brush and the same brass color selected, we're going to be painting in these teardrop patterns. Now, one thing that might help would be if we just create a curved line right at the top so that we know that they're all starting at the same level. It's a bit easy, otherwise our levels might misalign and not be consistent throughout. So we're just creating one line and then erasing the interims in between. It's just a little trick that you can use in your artwork. Okay, now paint in these outlines for the teardrop pattern here. And then fill it in. We're going to be reducing the opacity of this layer in a second so that it doesn't look so dark in a way. Now you can totally use the symmetry tool as well to make things easier for yourself. If it's placed perfectly in the center. I just didn't feel that it was necessary. I wanted to bring a bit more variation in this illustration, so I haven't used that here, but you can. Now reduce the opacity of this layer to about 30%. And then we're going to just turn off the sketch layer so that it's a bit easier for us to see exactly what we're doing. Create a new clipping mask and change the blend mode of this one to multiply. We're going to be creating some shadows. Now we want shadows specifically to our teardrop pattern. So let's go ahead and select that layer and then return to our new shadow clipping mask layer, and with the soft airbrush, just reduce the brush size to around 10%. And just around the edges, we want to go ahead and paint in these shadows. So this is what will help us to create a sort of a debossing effect in this brass stand. And that's the kind of effect we want to achieve. So we want shadows on one side and highlights on the other. So this is the first layer of shadows that we're creating for the teardrop pattern. And as you can see, it's already starting to look like, yes, it's a little deeper. The teardrop pattern has been excavated into the stand in a way. Now blend it out a little bit with the soft airbrush. We'll create another layer of shadows just above this in a minute. Alright, so now create another clipping mask and change the blend mode to multiply. And then again with the soft airbrush, just reduce the size of your brush to around 5% this time, and only at the edges paint in the shadows. So now it's looking like, yes, we've got a definite step in our teardrop pattern there. That is one way that you can definitely draw these debossed effects in any of your illustrations. Okay, so looking pretty good. We're now going to be adding in some highlights. So create a new clipping mask and change the blend mode to add. And this time we'll continue using the same brass color. So let's go ahead. Actually, no. We're going to go ahead and use this pale yellow color and paint in some of these highlights just around the central areas where we've got the original highlight going across the entire layer 4. And then apply a Gaussian blur of around 3% again. Reduce the opacity of this layer to around 40% now. That's looking better. Okay, so we're creating another clipping mask and then change the blend mode to add. And then just around the edges, we've reduced the brush size again to around 6%. Actually even more, 5% seems to be decent. Just around the edges, as you did for the shadows, we're painting in these highlights. So this is again going to help us create that delineating step effect, the debossing effect for our teardrop pattern. Your selection still remains on, and this helps us to keep our highlights within the range of the teardrops. So we've blurred it again to 3%, and then we can use the smudge tool to blend it out again slightly. Alright, so that's looking beautiful. I do think we need a little bit more texture to this, so we'll be doing that in a second, but let's just group all of these layers together and rename this group as Brass 4. You'll see that our brass stand has areas that are more in the shadows and more in the light, so we're going to create that effect as well. So let's go back to Brass 1 group and create a new clipping mask there and change the blend mode to multiply this time. So this entire Brass group 1 is more in the shadow area. So let's go ahead and paint in this darker color there with the same brass color, but because it's in multiply, it's in shadows. And then we're going to create this effect for Brass group 3 as well. So create a new clipping mask there. And then change the blend mode of this one to multiply as well. and just paint in the shadow areas there too. As you can see, now we're getting this proper 3D effect there. Okay, so enhance this effect again for brush group 4. So create a new clipping mask and change the blend mode to multiply. And just around this upper edge and the lower edge, we'll be creating in these shadows. We're using the same soft airbrush. And just for the lower edge, we're going to extend these shadows a little bit into the teardrop pattern there as well. And then apply a Gaussian blur of around 3%, actually 5%. That looks good. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is just go ahead and increase the opacity of the highlights layers a bit. Because we've added the shadows, I think we can increase the opacity of the highlight layers of the second brush group to about 80%, both of those layers. It brings out the shininess a bit more. So that's looking good. And then we can do the same for brush layer 4 as well. So let's go down to our initial highlight layer and then reduce the opacity of the highlight layer to about 70 or 80%. Now create a new clipping mask right on top of the brush group in the brush group 4 and then change the blend mode to add. And then with the brush color again, we're going to be painting in the highlights between the teardrop patterns. And I've just changed the color to the pale yellow color, and as you can see, it's going on to the teardrop pattern there too. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to select the teardrop pattern and then tap on invert this time so that our highlights do not touch the teardrops. So we return to our highlight layer, the new highlight clipping mask we'd made, and then we're painting in the highlights between these teardrop patterns. And then extending it slightly around the rim of the stand too. And then go ahead and apply a Gaussian blur of around 5 to 6%. 5% looks good. And then reduce the opacity of this layer to around 55%. Okay, so this is looking good, but what we need to do is add in some more highlights to all of our brush layers. So let's go ahead and open up brush group 1, create a new clipping mask there and change the blend mode to add. We're only adding a rim of highlight with the same brush color, just around the lower edge. And then apply a Gaussian blur of around 3%. And we're going to and we've just reduced the opacity of this layer to around 80%. Now we'll continue this rim of light on brush group 2 as well. So create a new clipping mask there and then change the blend mode to add again. And then continue with that line there so that, you know, it's not a stark difference between groups 1 and 2, and similarly groups 2 and 3. So now apply a Gaussian blur of about 4% for this one, and then reduce the opacity to around 80%. Now you can see that the edge looks a bit more congruent with each other. That's exactly the effect that we want. So let's go ahead and do that again for brush group 3. Create a new clipping mask and change the blend mode to add. And then we're going to draw this little line there, just at the upper edge. And then apply a blur, again of 3%. You can extend it slightly onto the sides if you want. And then again, we're reducing the opacity to 80%. Okay, so next we move on to brush group 4 and then create a new clipping mask there and change the blend mode to add again. Oh, this menu is annoying. And then we're going to add in our rim highlights there as well. So on the lower edge and then extending it along the sides as well. Then go ahead and apply a Gaussian blur of around 3% to this too, and reduce the opacity to 80%. Now create a new clipping mask to brush group 5 and change the blend mode to add. You know the drill, we're going to add another rim of highlights just on the top surface, top edge of brush group 5. Don't apply anything on the lower one, we'll be applying shadows there. So blur it up again to about 3% and then reduce the opacity to around 80% again. Okay, so we're just going to go back to our highlights layer in group 4, and then with the stucco brush we're trying to achieve that weathery, grainy kind of look there as well as your smudge tool, just like we did for all the other highlights. Okay, so now we've gone back to our brush group 5 and we've created a new clipping mask there, and we've changed the blend mode of this clipping mask to linear burn this time. And with the soft airbrush along the lower edge of this layer of this stand, as you can see, we're trying to create a bit more of a shadow effect there with the linear burn blend mode, and then again applied a blur of around 3% and reduce the opacity of this layer to about 60%. Okay, so that's looking good. Now let's go ahead and work on these inlays and gems. So we're going to work on the inlays first, create a new clipping mask there and change the blend mode to multiply. We've still got our brass color selected and the soft airbrush. I've reduced the size of the brush to around 3%, but you can see what works for you. Just around the areas where we're expecting our shadows to be, because our light source is mainly going to be the crystal ball itself. The shadows here would be lying opposite that, so they will be on the lower edge of the inlays. So we're creating all our shadows on those sides. So make sure you get the shadows on all the lower surfaces of the inlays. Inlays, filigrees, whatever you might want to call them. And then paint in similar shadows under the gems as well. Next, go ahead and create another clipping mask and change the blend mode to add this time. We're adding in our first set of highlights to the inlays and filigrees. So reduce the brush size to around 3%, and then our highlights will be on the opposite sides of the shadows. Paint in your highlights there. And then create a new clipping mask, and then change the blend mode to add, and with the pale yellow color we'll be painting in the reflections, or the second set of highlights. Actually, I think this will be the second set of highlights rather than reflections, because the reflection would be from the crystal ball itself. We'll be painting this greenish bluish kind of a reflection from the crystal ball on the entire brass stand in a bit. Alright, so that looks good. We're reducing the opacity of this layer to about 70%. And then let's go ahead and group all of our inlays layers together and then rename this group as Inlays. Okay, so next we're going to be creating a new clipping mask to the brush 2 group layer and then changing the blend mode of this layer to linear burn. Now we'll be creating the shadows of these inlays and gems on the base brush stand layers. So we've still got our brush color selected now. And then we're painting in the shadows caused by the inlays and the gems and the filigrees onto the brush stand itself. Now you'll be repeating this step for the brush layer 5 as well, the brush group 5, because that's where the second set of shadows are. It's like second set of gems and inlays are. So just apply a Gaussian blur of around 2% to this and then reduce the opacity of this layer to around 80%. That looks beautiful. Now repeat this step for brush group 5, create a new clipping mask there, and then change the blend mode to linear burn, and then paint in your shadows. Once you're done with that, once again apply a Gaussian blur of about 2% and then reduce the opacity of this layer to 80%. Okay, so they look much more realistic now. It's time to work on the gems. So let's go ahead and create a new clipping mask to the gems layer. And then change the blend mode of this layer to multiply. And then we're going to go ahead and select the same color as the gems themselves. And then just around the center of the round gems, paint in a darker gradient there with the soft airbrush. And for the diamonds, we're going to try and create this four window kind of an effect here. As you can see, we're trying to leave the central cross area for the highlights later. These will be blended in anyway, but it kind of helps to have these spaces left for them. And then apply a Gaussian blur just around 2%. Actually, you can increase it to about 3% more, so in total about 5%. Now create a new clipping mask and then change the blend mode of this one to multiply. Again, we're creating shadows at the edges of all the gems. We've still got our soft airbrush selected and the same green color as the gems themselves. We're painting in these shadows just at the edges. And then go ahead and apply a Gaussian blur to this layer as well for about 2%. And now it's time to add in some highlights. So create a new clipping mask, change the blend mode of this layer to add. And then with this bright light green color at the bottom of our color palette, we're going to be painting in highlights on the top edges of the round gems with the same soft airbrush. And as for our diamonds, we're reducing the size of the brush to about 2%, and we're trying to achieve this cross kind of an effect here. Now apply a Gaussian blur. Actually, reduce the opacity of the layer first to about 50% and then apply a Gaussian blur of around 2%. Okay, we'll create a final layer of highlights here. So create a new clipping mask and then change the blend mode of this layer to add. Now with the white color in our color palette, we'll be painting in some highlights there. So increase the brush size of your soft airbrush to about 4 to 5%. And for your round gems, paint in your highlights at the top edge. And reduce the size of the brush to about 2%. And for the diamonds, paint in these highlights, leaving some space at the edges of the crosses. Don't cover the entire cross, but just around the central areas. You can paint in these highlights. And then you can use the soft airbrush as your smudge tool and blend in these highlights slightly. Okay, so our gems are ready and they look beautiful. So let's go ahead and just duplicate this last layer of the highlights that we'd made. Just go ahead and apply a Gaussian blur to the lower duplicated layer of just around 3%. So that's an additional sort of sparkly effect that we've got here. We're even going to repeat this step for the top layer and blur it up slightly to around 1 to 2%. I think that looks much nicer. Okay, so gems are ready. The next thing that we need to be working on are our drops and the stars. So we're just going to group these gems layers together and then rename this group as gems. And then, as you can see, we've got our star layer below the drops layer. We just want to move the stars layer to the top. Now let's work on the drops first. So create a new clipping mask and change the blend mode to multiply. We're adding in some shadows with the brass color. Now play around with the brush size that you're comfortable with here for the soft airbrush. I've used around a 4%. It might be too big for you or you might be comfortable with it, but see what works for you. Just paint in these shadows on the opposite side of the light source. And then reduce the opacity of this layer to around 80%. Now create a new clipping mask and then change the blend mode of this layer to add. And then on the opposite side of the shadows, we're painting in the highlights. Now go ahead and group all of these layers together and rename this group as drops. It's time to work on the stars now. So create a new clipping mask and then change the blend mode to multiply. We're adding in the shadows to make our stars look a bit more three-dimensional. With the same color as the stars, we're trying to create our shadows opposite to where our light source is coming from. So for guidance, you can see where I'm placing the shadows. They're not exactly in place as you would expect them to. Some areas would be lighter, but this is a basic way of drawing some 3D stars this way. Okay, then we're going to create another clipping mask and change the blend mode to add this time. And we're painting in our highlights on the opposite sides of our shadows. The entire star doesn't have to be covered with highlights. There are some areas which you can leave. And then apply a Gaussian blur to this highlights layer of around 3%. We've also applied the blur to the shadows layer of the stars, just about 2 to 3% there. Now, we want to make these stars glow a bit more. So let's go ahead and duplicate the base of our stars layer. I've reduced the opacity of our highlights layer to 40%, by the way. And once you've duplicated the base star layer, we've changed the blend mode of the lower duplicated layer to add. And then we're applying a Gaussian blur of around 5% to this lower duplicated layer. And as you can see, our stars are glowing. So next we're going to reduce the opacity of this glowing layer to about 60%. And I think that looks beautiful. All right, so you can see that our stars are glowing. We also want a greenish effect to be coming off from the crystal ball itself. So let's go ahead and create a new clipping mask. And then we're going to select this crystal ball green color itself, the first green color on a color palette. And with the soft airbrush, we're going to be painting in the greenish color on almost all of our brush stands, the stars, the drops, the vertical stand, the inlays. We'll be repeating this step for all of them. So create a Gaussian blur of about 3% on this layer and then reduce the opacity to 85%. You can even increase the blur a bit more to about 3%. Now let's repeat this step for the drops. Before that, group all of our star layers together and rename the group as stars. Now go to the drops group, create a new clipping mask there, and we're continuing with the normal mode, but we're reducing the opacity to about 85%, just as we did for the stars. We're painting in the greenish glow on the drops. And then applying a Gaussian blur of 3%. Repeat this step for the vertical brass layer. Create a new clipping mask there. And then reduce the opacity to 85%. You've increased the brush size slightly to about 5%. We're painting in this greenish glow on that too. If you really like the brass effect that is already there on the stand and you don't want to add in the greenish glow, you can totally omit it, it's fine. But once we've added in the swirls to around the crystal ball itself, you'll see why this greenish glow is kind of a bit necessary. Create a new clipping mask to brass group 1 now, and then paint in the greenish glow there too. It does take away from the beautiful gold chrome effect that we've got there on our brass stand, but I think if we paint this in, it gives it a nice ethereal kind of mystical glow to our entire illustration then. And remember, you can always blend all of these greenish glows too with the soft airbrush. And then repeat this step for, we'll cover the inlays in a bit, but repeat this step for brass 2 group. So create a new clipping mask there, and then paint in this greenish glow in that area too. Apply a Gaussian blur of around 5% to this layer, and then reduce the opacity to 85%. Next, let's go to brass group 3, create a new clipping mask there, and then paint in this greenish glow slightly, mostly concentrated on the upper edge of this layer. Apply a blur again, 5%, and reduce the opacity to 85%. I'm just blending it out a bit more. It looks too green in some areas. Now create a new clipping mask to brass group 4, and we're painting in the greenish glow on that too. Then apply a Gaussian blur of about 5% again, and reduce the opacity to 85%. Now create a clipping mask to brass 5 group, and you know the drill, we're adding in the greenish glow here as well. And then blurring it up again, this time to about 8%, and reducing the opacity to 85%. I'm blending in some of this greenish glow again with the soft airbrush. And then we're going to our Inlays group and creating a clipping mask there, reducing the opacity to 85% and adding in our greenish glow just to the tops of our inlays too. I've added them to the lower edges as well as reflected light. It does give the whole illustration a bit more of a ghostly kind of an effect, doesn't it? And then you can blur it slightly as well if you want, just about 1 to 2%. Okay, so that's looking pretty nice. We're going to turn our sketch back on now. It's time to draw in this magical swirl around the crystal ball. So go right to the top above the stars group and create a new layer there. And change the blend mode of this layer to add. We're using the lightest green color, which is the last color on our color palette. And then returning to our technical pen brush in inking, you can increase the brush size to about 37 to 40% and then go ahead and paint in this swirl right around the crystal ball. And once you're done with that, duplicate this layer and select the lower of the duplicated layer over there. As you can see, we might have to blur it up a bit, but I think we'll do that once we've actually finished with the effects of the top layer. So return to the top layer for now, and then reduce the opacity of that layer to somewhere around 80–81%. Turn off the sketch layer, and then with the soft airbrush as your blending tool, reduce the size of your brush to around 8%. We need to be able to blur out this smoky effect in this top layer, but I think it's a bit better if we can visualize exactly what we're trying to blend here. So to be able to do that, we're going to be just turning off the second layer or the second duplicated layer, and then you can finally see what you're trying to blend. So the way to do this kind of smoky blending kind of effect is to blend outward from the color and then try and create some more gaps in between. As you can see, I'm leaving some areas very thin and some areas are thicker. You can blend from inwards to outwards, from the color to the edge to create this smoky effect. And just blur it out. See what works for you. What kind of effect are you looking for? You can play around with the brush size as well. That really helps. Liquify is a good tool to use here as well, but then it's a little unpredictable. I like using the blending tool here. It kind of gives me more control over what areas I want to be able to blend. especially for this kind of a technique. So it's a very wispy kind of effect that we're achieving with this particular smoky magical effect. You can obviously make it much less wispier if that's your thing. I think I will make those changes a little later because it looks a bit too wispy here for me. Too many tendrils coming out unnecessarily. But if it works, if this is the kind of pattern that you want for your illustration, you definitely go for it. Now you can see this part of the wisp is behind the stand, so I've just erased it as I've done it from this left side of the stand too. And I've slightly increased the brush size and I'm smoothing out some of these wisps. Especially on this upper end here. I want it to be a bit smoother at this surface. This might take a few tries to get it to look perfectly the way you want it to look, so don't worry if it takes time. It's completely fine. This is a technique that you're trying to master, so it takes time. Skills take time to develop. And I think that looks great. You can even paint in some newer areas if you feel like you need some more color, if you run out of color by blending it out too much. Now switch your second duplicated layer and now apply a Gaussian blur of this to this layer of, let's say, around 10%. There you go. That looks so nice. It's a nice glowing kind of a swirl. And as you can see, the greenish light paid off, didn't it? On all of these brass stands there. So this is definitely going to give off a greenish light. So that's why we needed to paint it on the entire brass stand. Okay, so now it's time to paint in the last bits here. We've got to paint in the stars. So we've turned the sketch layer back on, and this time we're just going to create a new layer above the swirl layer and change the blend mode of that layer to add. And with the white color and the technical pen brush again, just reduce the size of the brush to around 3%. We're painting in these stars. So you can either just paint in across like that and then centrally a rough curved diamond, just like I have. You don't need to be ultra precise here. We're going to be blurring out this layer. So just paint in a rough curved diamond sort of a star here, just like I'm doing here now. And then go ahead and apply a Gaussian blur of about 3% to this layer. And we're going to create one more layer above that. Change the blend mode to add, and this time just paint in crosses with the same technical pen brush and the white color, just crosses. Obviously, if you've got stamp brushes, you can use those. If you've got something else like a light pen, you can use that for the brush too. This is just another technique of adding in stars. And you can slightly blur it to just about 1%. I think that looks pretty nice. Not too overboard with sparkly bits, because our entire thing looks really glowing anyway. For our last effect, we're creating a new layer right above the background, and then changing the blend mode to multiply. And then we're going to select the same background color, the dark teal color. And with the soft brush in airbrushing, we're going to paint in a darker gradient just behind the entire crystal ball. Once you're done with that, you can apply a Gaussian blur of around 25% to this, and that looks absolutely beautiful. That's it for this one, guys. Thank you so much for joining me in this tutorial, and I hope you had fun creating a bit of magic with me today. If you'd like to share your creation with me, remember to tag me in your post on Instagram. I love seeing your versions of the tutorial and sharing them on my Instagram page. Make sure to subscribe to my channel if you like the tutorial, and don't forget to get your sketches and palettes from the Artistic Archive with the link in the description. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.